Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 9 of the Open Source Cowboy Podcast. Christian, Open Source Cowboy, everyone already knows me. I am pleased and thrilled to have extinguished guest Danese Cooper with us. She was a part of helping InterSource come to its vision a long time ago, helping us pioneer open source movement and things. And she's been well connected with supporting some of our Cardano longtime contributors like Addie and Johnny. So I'll hand it over to you, Danese. I can't do a better intro than yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm getting to the point where conversations like this are mostly what I do because people want to know what happened, and I'm constantly reminded that we really should have done a better job of catching the history as it was going by, but we were busy, and now people argue over what really happened. But isn't that how it always is?
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah, so I was lucky enough to get hired to do open source right at the very beginning of that name. And I worked for a company that was driven in interesting ways as the Sun Microsystems. They were an engineering company for sure, but weirdly, if there'd been a public announcement, they really felt like they had to honor those. And some VP made an announcement at Tokyo Java One that they were going to open source Java, and without checking with anybody else about whether that was a desired thing. And he left a little bit after that and left, this open question that they were getting pummeled by. So they hired me and one other guy to create an office and work on open sourcing Java. And I had been an engineering manager before that at Apple,
Mhm.
and I was at Microsoft for 6 horrible months at one point. Um, and so, I knew the ropes essentially, but I was also really frustrated because Apple was such a closed shop, and it was inefficient, and it bothered me how inefficient it was. And of course, I was, bothered by Microsoft just because they put out crap and expected everybody to use it, and weren't willing to let us fix it when we certainly could have. So I thought open source sounded like a great idea,
Yeah.
right? And then 6 months in to working for Sun, I had given a few talks. People in the open source movement, and especially the free software movement, had been working hard to get me to understand that I didn't know what I was talking about. Um, and I was listening to them, and I started realizing that they weren't really doing what they needed to do to get the thing done that I was hired to do, and that those engineers were not going to budge on that. And so I quit. But unbeknownst to myself, there was only 0.5% unemployment in Silicon Valley in 1999, and they couldn't let me go, because I was productive. And so they said the thing. And if anybody ever says this to you in your career, you remember this conversation. They said, "What would it take to keep you here?" And I did already have another job, like because I was a mom, I had to always stack my work, right? Oh, by the
Mhm.
way, always be interviewing. Always be interviewing. Everybody has to. All of you who are listening, even if you're loyal Cardano employees, you need to be happy where you are, and you need to know that you're making what you should make and that you're enjoying what you're doing. And one of the ways you can do that is to continually have conversations with people that are trying to hire you. It makes you feel amazing every time you say no. And every so often you say yes, So anyway,
Yeah.
so I quit, and they offered me this open-ended, what would keep you here? And I was just a program manager. I was way down in the hierarchy.
Mhm.
And I said, well, you've pissed off the free software community and the open source community pretty hard by insisting that the license you wrote for Java is better. And they're not going to give up on that because they have nothing to lose. You're going to need friends, and they like me because I actually agree with them. So maybe make me your personal, your spokesmodel for open source with a higher profile. And they said, well, what would your title be? And I said, Chief Open Source Evangelist. And they said, sure. So all of a sudden, I'm getting much better speaking engagements because I represent Open Java, and I'm the only person talking about Open Java that wants to see it happen and is in a position to
Mhm.
influence it. So all of a sudden, I'm best friends with Tim O'Reilly because a huge part of their money came from the manuals that they wrote for Java, and they really wanted to see it open.
Yeah.
and a bunch of other people like that. It was a fascinating process learning to, after building trust with the community, which the community managers need to build trust with the community. This is for open source. For inner source, even you need to build trust among the engineers, but it's a smaller pool.
Yeah.
When you step into a role that straddles your company's position and the position that the world wants to hear about, you have to become a diplomat. And what I used to do was I would stand in the middle of the stage and I would faithfully reproduce whatever the message house was for Sun that week. And then I would take a step to the right or the left and I would lean into the audience and say, "This is what I think." And then I'd go
Mm.
back, stand in the center and take questions and give the right answers from Sun's perspective. But I had planted that seed that I wasn't an automaton and that I could see what was happening. And it really helped with negotiating when Sun inevitably did the wrong thing. Because they did believe in open source. They just, it's a kind of NIMBY thing that,
Yeah.
the Solaris people really thought that Java should be open. And the Java people really thought Solaris should be open. And
Yeah.
so and as I was telling you before in the chat we had before, I also learned a lot about the politics. I think it pays to be non-hierarchical. I mean, don't stab your boss in the back if you can help it, but definitely make your own friendships, because you might need them. I had the
Yeah.
top lawyer on my side at one point. I had a product manager who was the VP who was absolutely pissed off because I was suggesting that we needed to give the code away to something, and he didn't want to see it happen that way. And he tried to say it wasn't going to be legal, and I had the top lawyer right there going, "No, actually, it's just fine." Like it's
Well,
helpful.
especially when you're talking about IPs, trademarks,
Yeah,
corporate interests, politics surfing is a must.
yeah. You just
Especially,
you just have to do it. You have to build a support
yeah.
net, a safety net. And when I started talking about inner source, which we're kind of jumping ahead here, but I did 6 years at Sun as their open source guru. When I left, it was actually covered everywhere. It was surprised me, truthfully.
Mm.
It's seen as a really big deal. I went to Intel and I worked on open source for them on projects we could only talk about outside the United States, but that was fine with me. I like to travel. And then I worked for a startup that they put me in. As I was leaving Intel, they injected me into a startup that needed good open source advice. Um, and they had made an A round investment in it and they were getting ready to lead a B round and they really wanted to see it do well. And that's why they sent me there. And my friend Brian Mellendorf was on the board. So we were sort of going to work together to push them in the right direction. It was an important technology. It's why you can do really big problems using something like R now in RAM. R
Mhm.
was hampered by the fact that it could only address a project question that would fit in the available RAM. And as soon as virtualized RAM happened, which this company invented, um, all of a sudden, you could make a supercomputer out of x86 boxes, which is why Linux took off. So it was an important
Mm.
little
Yeah.
piece of the puzzle. Anyway, I was there. Um, they achieved their funding. The guy that they picked as their boss hated me. He didn't understand open source. And I told them that it was going to be a shit show, but they did it anyway because they wanted the money. Anyway, and then my next job was Wikipedia. So,
Mm.
I had this set of confluences that kept me moving in a direction that was going to keep my name in the forefront for a long time. And that gave me a lot of time to think about what to do next. When we came around to the big anniversary and the big moment when Microsoft capitulated and decided that open source was the best thing,
Mm.
thank you, Satya Nadella, we I was already thinking, okay, now what do we do? Because we've built this big fungus. I used to talk about companies like fungus. We built this massive mushroom, and its stalk is not really strong enough to hold it up, and it's going to fall over unless we figure out how to bring more people in. And they can't just be brand new people because it takes too long to get them to have the right instincts.
Yeah.
And I realized that there was a whole world. 85% of the engineers in the world never got to do open source at that point because they were inside corporate firewalls. And it's clear to me that the way that we code in open source is a way better way than all of the other ways I've seen, and I've been around for a lot of change in that, And so it occurred to me that we could retread the idea. Now, Tim O'Reilly had this idea in 2000. I started talking about it in 2014. The difference was in the interim, open source won. Unequivocally, right around 2012, open source started showing signs of winning. And by
Yeah.
2014, we were way over the line. And so in when Tim O'Reilly talked about it in 2000, it was really easy for middle management to bat it away as a constructive idea because open source didn't have any credibility. And we were intentionally being uncredible because it kept the likes of Microsoft from trying to kill us. Why would they
Yeah.
waste the time and the public scrutiny when they thought that we were, going to fall apart in any minute? So that was a practice thing to look a little. That's one of the reasons that this Free Software Foundation was so useful, because their street theater thing was not doesn't resonate with business. The idea of using the word free doesn't resonate with business, which
Yeah.
is the
100%.
insight that Tim had, right? So anyway, by 2014, I was like, we got to do something to make sure that there are more troops available, and we need maintainers, because most open source people, the people that were drawn to the open source movement, were rabbits. They wanted to work on a cool thing, get it to a cool place, and then go work on another cool thing
Yeah.
instead of maintaining the one they just wrote. And they wanted to write in Go and Lisp and, languages that are lovely languages, but maybe not easy to hire maintainers in.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, if we inoculate the world with open source methods called inner source, because it's going to help you clean up the mess that is your accreted engineering practice in a big company, then some percentage of the engineers that experience that are going to love it and are going to want more. And as long as we simultaneously work on, you should let your people work on some things in open source, right? We start finding a new venue for maintainers, because that's what they like to do, most of them, right? I'm painting with a broad brush here, but the reason that there are 8,000 engineers at PayPal is because a lot of those people like to maintain, right?
Yeah. 100%.
So anyway, that's why I started talking about inner source when I did, when I came into PayPal, and I didn't want that job. I was consulting to them, and they really wanted me to be an employee, and I really didn't want to work for a bank. But they made it very hard for me to say no by just sort of upping the ante and upping the ante. When they finally said that I could keep all my existing clients and keep my consultancy open while being an employee of of PayPal, I thought, well, there you go. And when I came in the door, I said, I don't know exactly. I mean, I will teach you guys about open source, but there's something else I'm going to do here, but I don't exactly know what it is. And I really didn't yet. It was maybe 3 weeks later that I realized it was going to be inner source. They were in the middle of the biggest day one forward agile transformation in history. They took the whole company, all 8,000 employees, day one forward, we're all agile now. So they, of course, hired a small army of agile consultants. And 4 years in and millions of dollars of spend on that, they still only had 16% participation in the engineering community. So when I designed InnerSource for PayPal, I did everything differently. I didn't take much budget. I didn't centralize a bunch of experts. I created experts within the little groups, and found groups that were doing it and made them famous inside the company and outside, and started talking about InnerSource as the way we were going to transform that company. Now, it didn't entirely transform the company. But what was interesting was every little group that really embraced it and got good at it and showed that it could make the change happen that we wanted to see. Every single one of them, immediately upon hearing that their project was going to go back to the old way, left the company and started a better project and used our methods, right?
Yeah.
And then we started having banks be very interested in us because I worked for PayPal. So I'm going to all these like early Finos conferences, things like that, talking about how this could transform engineering without you having to completely reinvent the wheel, because you could do it behind the firewall. And so all the turmoil that might be brand effacing would be hidden, essentially,
Yeah.
until you got to a point where you could show the benefits. And then it's something you could actually talk about. It's process. It's definitely not secret sauce. There's no, so you might as well, right? And every major bank uses it now deeply. And it's really, really changed a lot of the engineering weirdness in most of those companies, which, I like a lot. It also validates it. That's why Gartner's interested.
Yeah. I
So,
I would say it's definitely caught, because when you're going from talking about specifically code things and legal concerns that way to an internal methodology that adapts to be more agile than agile itself,
yep,
and it's just more inherent to the way people work and moldable that way. It's
yep,
definitely going to catch traction. Um, for those who aren't fully familiar with inner source, could you kind of lay out some basic key concepts for it, just so that
sure.
they understand why it was so attractive?
Well, so the shorthand, I used to say inner source is open source inside. So the open source method works like this. Um, you have a problem that you need to solve. It might be in your own code base that you're supposed to manage, or it might be in one adjacent to you, like a service that you isn't working the way you need it to work. The old-fashioned way to do this, and the way that an awful lot of companies still work, is you file a ticket, and which goes into some queue, and eventually it might get assigned as work to the person that knows how to fix it. But they won't necessarily come back and talk to you. So the likelihood that it's going to actually do what you need it to do is pretty low. What InnerSource lets you do is go read that code that needs to be changed, whoever makes the change, and see if you can understand it and contribute a fix that solves your problem. And it goes into a queue. It doesn't automatically go into the code and get, sent out to customers. That would be a bad idea, because it's still a corporation and there's still
Yeah.
legacy. You don't know everything you need to know. But it does open a conversation between you and an expert in that code base. That expert is spending a portion of their time not coding, but helping people like you be more effective at lending code to solve your problems. And the place that this really shone, and we, again, timing is everything. We were very lucky that continuous integration and deployment started happening right about the time we started making a lot of noise about InnerSource. And that was a greenfield opportunity, because every company in the world had to do something about that. But there were no prefab solutions that were fitting everybody, because everybody had these hand-built, one handful of mud at a time engineering process.
Yeah.
And so it was impossible to make generic stuff. So some percentage of the people that got in on the ground floor of InnerSource immediately saw that there was an opportunity to fix the internal issues using this method. The first one I met was Bosch. Believe it or not, Bosch, which I think of as a fairly stodgy company. I mean, they make tools and heavy
Hmm.
machinery, and they do research. They're a public benefit corporation. They have been for like 100 years. That's kind of cool, but they have thousands and thousands of employees, and it's a big company. But there was a guy in the labs who thought that if they could just lighten the process a little bit and experiment with people working not on the cost code that they were assigned to work on, but something that was in the way, or some idea they had, they wanted to see if it could foster more innovation, because their problem was everybody worked in lockstep and innovation was almost impossible to insert. So they were given a fair amount of money by the board, and they found some candidates that were, inventors. They're in every company, right?
Hmm.
And they were able to buy them out of their contract with their managers, so that they could have more freedom. And they built their own code management tools that were more transparent than the ones that were being used generally. And they were able to prove very quickly, really in just a couple of years, the tangible benefit to the company of having this kind of thing. And then the board said, okay, let's do it for everybody now.
Well, I
So
feel like
anyway,
it's
yeah, so
even.
so finding
Yeah.
them, and they were 8 years in when I met them. They'd been playing with it for a long time. In fact, they called it Bosch Internal Open Source, or BIOS.
Mm.
And we talked a little bit before about naming. I'm I want to see inner source quoted as the method because it becomes a way for people to go look for it on the internet. But I don't have a problem with individual companies coming up with whatever nomenclature works for them, as long as they understand what they're doing. The only time I ever got involved in changing a company's mind about that was IBM. And it's because they're IBM. I mean, you're too young to know this, but there was a serious debate for the first 10 years of my work about whether it was a disk drive or a fixed disk, because IBM called it a fixed disk. And their nomenclature was considered sacrosanct. And I just didn't want them to cause a problem. And that's the pitch I made. I said, I don't really care what you tell it, other people it's called, as long as you don't tell the public that you call it that. So anyway, back to what inner source is. If you were to take the iterative conversation between the engineer who's in charge of that piece of code and is talking to somebody who's from outside their organization, some other part of the company that wants to influence a fix, if you capture that conversation, which those mostly happen on the phone if you're all in the same place, or you walk over to see somebody if you're in a massive campus. So it's actually really advantageous if you're not co-located, because then it's more likely that you're going to write your questions out and your answers.
Mm-hmm.
If you capture those and create a searchable archive, this is the secret sauce of Apache. Because every decision at Apache is made on the mailing list. If it didn't happen on the mailing list, it doesn't exist. Even if the serious leaders of that era of Apache got together and decided something was going to happen, if it wasn't also stated on the mail list and open for discussion, it never happened. Like, this is a really basic tenet. All conversations are public to Apache. I mean, it's inside their firewall, so it's inner source essentially, right? But they had the advantage many years ago. One of the people in Apache worked for a company that owned an indexing system for mail. And they modified their mail system, or their indexing system, to work on Mailman, because Apache uses lowest common denominator tools, and created a durable, searchable archive of every conversation that's ever happened about any topic in their world. And so you can go research it. And why is that a good thing? Because if you want to give me code and the only asset you have is looking at my code and trying to understand it, because you haven't opened a conversation with me, you're afraid to give me a ticket if the thing that you're suggesting is stupid. So you're trying to figure out if this is a reasonable way to go. If it was an Apache project, you could go search the archive. You could read every conversation about how it got the way it is now. The last time somebody tried what you're trying and what broke, all the things you need to know, right? And so if you can build that inside your company, you are suddenly not afraid of whole groups leaving and creating orphan code, because you have documentation about it. And it's serviceable documentation. It's actionable. It is completely different than what happens if you tell everybody you're not coding this week, you're just writing documentation, because that is not going to be good documentation.
Yeah.
Right. The only actionable conversation is between two engineers who are trying to bridge a knowledge gap. And so that's actually the secret sauce of inner source. It's hard to do, though, because the temptation to pick up the phone or to do it on chat, there's 1,000 ways to have a conversation right now. So when I envisioned tooling for inner source, I thought it would be really cool if there was a messaging platform that was extensible to all the different ways people talk to each other, so that those things could be captured too. And it would be possible for engineers to say, this was the best advice I got, I'm sending this to the archive, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, we knew that it worked because we saw it work every day in open source. We knew that it was possible to adopt it if you could figure out how to wheedle your way through the politics of the company. And it turns out it's almost always middle management that's the problem. Almost always.
Preferred ways of doing things.
So there's two ways, well, or other reasons. I mean, let's give them the altruistic reason. They think that they're saving people's jobs. They don't want to take on something new that may or may not work, may or may not be more efficient, because they've got all these people whose jobs they're responsible for. They're measured based on cost codes. It's impossible to let your resources spend time outside of the cost codes if you have to prove that they're turning in their performance every week. And that's how you save their jobs.
Yeah.
Like there's lots of altruistic reasons that middle management is not quick to adopt inner source. In companies where you find a middle manager that's quick to adopt it, if you can find a VP and his directs that all want to do it, you will absolutely have a case study in how good it could be. And part of my advice inside companies is go find that group, get them to run the experiment, make it bounded, run it just like a scientific experiment, have a hypothesis, how much it's going to help, what problems it's going to solve, what pain is going to be involved. Run the experiment, keep good notes. Did you guess right, or were you wrong about some things? Publish your results, rinse and repeat, right?
Well, I would say this is very forgetting the English word for metaphorically similar to like manufacturing plants with that
Uh-huh.
Japanese methodology where if you see the assembly line in progress, it actually innovates ideas to how to make it simpler rather than having siloed independent departments trying to
Correct.
just push a traveler.
Well, what I find, I mean, I've been in this industry now for almost 50 years, and what I see is ebb and flow between central and decentral. Central,
Hmm.
decentral. And that happens for a bunch of reasons. Some of it's just human nature. Everybody thinks that they can build a better bicycle, right?
Hmm.
But some of it has to do with technology. Like, wow, the CPUs are finally strong enough. There's enough storage. Storage is cheap enough. We can centralize this stuff and get rid of duplication. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Less overhead. There's a centralization point. Oh man, this was a mistake. Look at how, it's nobody's job, it's everybody's job. We should make it individual people's jobs. That's how you get decentralization. So, yeah. And you just have to learn how to ride those waves as a change agent. So when we started talking about InnerSource, I spent the first 3 years doing a class during the pre-days of any O'Reilly event. They would always have, voices teaching class, and you
Hmm.
could pay a little extra and get into those classes. And for the first 3 years, we ran a class. My staff at PayPal and some others who came along and were interested enough to stick with us. And it was basically just therapy for program managers and project leads to see if they had an appetite. So they could self-assess, do I have an appetite to push this agenda? Do I understand what the risks are for me and what it's going to feel like? Because we had to find a little army of people that were more tired of the sameness, more tired of watching the inefficiency than they were afraid.
Yeah.
And it worked. I probably taught it 10 or 11 times. I still get asked every so often to teach it again. Um, one of the things we did there, we'd have a whole room, like 50, 100, 200 people in the room, and they had to stop every so often and ponder a question and write their answer. And then, the first question is, what do you think the biggest problem in your organization is? But some of them were more specific to the person, like, you know, how do you feel when you're anxious, kind of thing, right? And then we would stop the show and make them turn to the person next to them, but they had to have a different person every time. And they'd get 5 minutes each to share their answer. And what they
Mm.
discover is everybody's got the same damn problem. Everybody. And everybody thinks it's only them. So if all you do is create a better council of people that can collectively problem solve, that's going to be better. But the hierarchical model keeps you from doing that. It sounds like it's supposed to do that. Like maybe the people who don't code anymore, who are up at the manager level, are supposed to get together and talk through problems, and then that's supposed to filter down to the engineers. But it never works that way.
Well, that's even like we launched a developer advocate program, and one of the first questions I engineered behind it was like, if you're in charge of a cultural shift, how do you implement those seeds to watch it grow? And the only way you can get company decision making to change is you have to have the body of employees come together, or at least in certain subsect, and that way it can counteract the middle management in between. Because if
Yeah,
enough
there's
rumors
there's two
come,
ways. There's two ways. There's ground up and there's top down. And they
yeah,
can both work. It just depends on how the company works and how bad the change is needed is one of the things. I'm going to briefly tell you the Russ Rutledge story. I haven't told it in a while, and he's the executive director of InterSource Commons right now.
Hmm.
I found him at Nike. He was a rank and file engineer. He got a CI/CD project to do for a single website. They had a portfolio of, like 25 or 30 websites, but he was only going to do his one. And he didn't see the efficiency in that. So he started writing in an open-ended way that would allow other people to use the same code when they got around to doing CI/CD, which
Hmm.
was, forward thinking. But he was having a hard time getting people to know about it because the whole company was sort of set up for, I mean, there was, you could go have a lunch conversation, but getting people in a room to talk about something serious was hard because there was a paucity of conference rooms. There was no good way to get people together.
Yeah.
He did the extra thing. He went, made friends with a senior admin, somebody who had a VP as their boss, got that person to help him hack the calendar so that he could do all the rooms on a Wednesday afternoon. And he did it like 3 months ahead. And then as it got close, he started talking to everybody that he knew about, do you have a problem you need to get together with some people to talk about so you can solve it? Well, I happen to have a room and I'd love to give it to you. And he didn't tell them that he had, 20 rooms, right?
Yeah.
And so there they are in the actual day, and they are, this is the biggest grassroots move ever, because just letting them talk to each other without bosses, with the clicker, because they're not touching their cost center often enough, or they're talking to people from the other side of the company or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, sometimes it's just as simple as diagnosing where the discommunication is. So then the next thing he knows, he's getting called into the CTO's office, and the CTO is actually very much in favor of what he's done, and he wants to institutionalize it. So he gives him, a job, the job he wanted. And yeah, there you go.
Well, that's yeah. Find a need and meet it.
But
Essentially.
do it in a
Yeah.
way that do it in a way
It's.
that works for you. I mean, this is the most respectful man. If you've ever talked to him,
Hmm.
he reminds me a little bit of Todd, that runs All Things Open. He's just another very happy, very helpful person who just wants to get to better solutions and is not trying to trash anybody. And he's clear about all that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I'll try and talk to him when I get the chance.
oh,
But
you
that.
should. He's great. Talk to him about
Yeah.
donation.
Will
InterSource
do.
InterSource Commons is a 501(c)(3), and it still only lives on donations. And taking another page from the Apache Software Foundation, when the Linux Foundation came calling, I didn't want to go there because that is a money earning organization, and sometimes it's for the greater glory of the event, or the topic, and sometimes things get a little muddled in the race to get sponsorship. We have very low sponsor numbers. It just covers the cost. We're not trying to amass any war chest.
Hmm.
So
Well, and I was gonna ask you anyway to elaborate since you had hinted at it. InterSource Commons, y'all have a upcoming conference too. I heard, right?
yeah, we totally do. It's apparently the 10th anniversary since we incorporated. Now, it was run by PayPal from 2014 until we incorporated.
Hmm.
So, it's, I always knew that it needed to be separate from PayPal, but it was easy to have it live there because then they paid for, crap, what is that
Back
project
in.
called? No, what's the messaging project that everybody was using? Slack.
Yeah, Slack.
Slack's cost structure is very strange, and it gets expensive very quickly. And they covered that while we were building. Right.
That's good.
And we learned about
Yeah.
Slack in that, so that when we spun out, we don't pay any fees for Slack. We use the free service and we get by.
That's
It's
good.
good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Uh,
can over tool. It's possible to over tool.
oh, I did 2 years helping workplace services for ServiceNow, and when Salesforce bought out Slack, they cut it off because the data shipped overseas, and they're
Uh-huh.
very concerned about that. So I know Slack can cause politics for people in different ways. But
Well,
that's
now that American data is not safe, I don't know if you'd make that decision again, right?
yeah. Well, actually, I was gonna ask you about that too, because so you basically probably set up one of the first OSPOs, even if not by definition, in the
It
world
was
that
the
it's.
first. It was the first OSPO.
Oh, it was the first.
Yeah, the name it's just a Sun convention, open source program office. Everything was a blah blah program office,
I
right?
got you.
Java program office, so Polaris program office. So yeah, it wasn't inspired on my part, but it was the first one called an OSPO, and there was one company that was ahead of us in their looking at open source, and I mean IBM was ahead of us, but they're stealth, they're stealthy.
Hmm.
But HP had B. Dale Garby and Stormy Peters, and they were running a real program office, but it was focused on Linux. So theirs was
Hmm.
called the Linux Program Office, and so mine was the first open source program office. But to be fair, they started theirs when there wasn't a term called open source yet, and I came into Sun right as open source was a new term. So.
So, well, all fair and game, I would say.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
when I set it
But
up,
you.
it got run different ways over the years. When I set it up
Hmm.
again, I was working hard on decentralization.
Yeah.
I'm pretty convinced that decentralization makes for better outcomes. Apple was heavily decentralized, even though it was super locked down, right?
Yeah.
Um, I grew up in tech. My degree's in French literature. It's not like I spent a lot of time in CS school looking at all the different ways you could do this. I did go take a I did go take a postgraduate degree at one point from UC Santa Cruz, along with the engineering manager I was working with at the time when I was at Symantec. So I learned a lot more about program management theory in that class, and
Mhm.
that was before I came to. Is that true? No, that was after Apple, before Sun. Yeah, it was before I came to Sun. So I was big on decentralization for my whole career because I think it offers more opportunities for individuals. And you know, I've been accused my whole career of not being a team player, except for the people that worked on my team who thought that I was great, usually. Um, I don't believe I am a bit of an iconoclast. Like I'm not necessarily convinced that just because it's always been this way, it should continue to be this way.
Oh yeah.
And and um and that is just in my nature. But
Well, and oh, go ahead.
yeah, but when I set up InterSource Commons, I was aware of a bunch of pitfalls of me being the spokesmodel for it because I had broken a lot of eggs in my time,
Hmm.
and I really wanted Microsoft to like InterSource, and they do. This is kind of interesting, but because they also needed to learn how to do open source. They hired a bunch of people out of Apache to work on Azure, so they had one team that really knew how to do it. But it wasn't fair to ask those guys to work on product and change the culture of the company. So InterSource kind of stepped in, right?
Yeah.
And originally it was Janugo, who was an Apache guy that was at Microsoft, right? That thought that we should do it this way. But another big problem was that people were going to say that it was a cult of personality because I was so visible at the beginning because there wasn't anybody else to be visible. There wasn't anybody else with a travel budget like mine. So,
Hmm.
and I was writing books for O'Reilly and all that stuff. So I consciously stepped back when I felt like we'd gotten to a point where the community was sort of holding it up anyway. And I've been
Hmm.
involved, but kind of only in name for the last, I want to say 3 years. And they're doing a bang up job. They're really good at what they're doing. I made some lucky hires. I hired Claire Dillon when I was still the only funder of InterSource Commons, and she figured out how to get the community to sponsor it and feel good about that. So she's brilliant at that.
Yeah.
Um,
I would say they've gotten a lot more clarity and recognition because I was just a open source analyst when y'all came in to consult InterSource for IOG, which we now call Better Open Source. But hey, whatever works.
sure.
And I can definitely see the traction from y'all, just from an outside stakeholder's point of view, because that was the first time I heard the word ISPO and stuff like that, and then I hadn't touched InterSource too much since we started Intersect, but y'all kept coming around to my sphere, whether it just be news feeds or everything else. So y'all
Yeah.
are definitely doing a bang up job that way.
Yeah. Claire was brilliant at all of that. And now she's on the board, but she's not an officer anymore because she's working on a PhD about inner source, which is
That's
great.
funny.
There's some percentage of people when they come to understand that work could be different than it has been for them, that they could have more freedom in work and more self-expression and more pride in what they're doing, and also have a better effect for the company. If they could get all of those things to happen at the same time, they're going to like their jobs a lot better.
Yeah.
And some of them get so turned on to it that they want to make it their life's work. And Claire's definitely one of those. She came from Microsoft, and she worked in Microsoft Ireland, so it was a backwater. So she wasn't all that aware of what a bully Microsoft was in the industry when Gates and Ballmer were running it. And so, you know, she learned a lot about that, but she also got so much more freedom and so much more impact for her work working in InnerSource. She fell in love with it. And she started the Open Ireland Network to try to help Ireland understand how they could change, which
Yeah.
is great to see. It's doing everything I wanted it to do. And I think a big part of why that's happening is because I stepped out.
Mm. Well, it's important to know even founders could go so far before you shift gears and then it gets success. Coca-Cola didn't take off until a guy had sold the IP to a guy who actually put it in glass bottles and shipped it wider than his
Yeah, I
little
did.
local market. That's
Yeah.
at least my common thing. I think she's actually, so I'm on pioneering different fronts on how Web3 can focus on open source sustainability. Solona is one of the influences behind that too. But
Mhm.
she's actually come in to speak at the Digital Resilience Forum, I think, too, that is founded by people trying to focus on that topic. Different ways of
Cool.
finding sponsorship, because funding open source maintainers is one thing, but there's also the dynamics when money gets involved. So they're
Yeah.
exploring that ethos and stuff.
Yeah, there has to be a better way than you're directed by your employer. You're allowed by your employer is way better than you're directed by.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, in the early days, like when I left Sun, I gave them, I think, 3 months notice, but most of the people that were in favor of me leaving were keeping the information from Jonathan Schwartz that I was going, because he was the CEO by then. It finally got to him. I was also running OSI with Michael Tiemann from Red Hat, and I'd been
Mhm.
doing it for a decade. Um, there was a change of president, and Michael formally became the president. And there was a press release, and I got a note from Jonathan Schwartz that said, "I'm not comfortable with Red Hat holding this position. Why didn't you take it?" And so I had to say, well, first of all, Red Hat doesn't hold that position. Michael holds it. If Michael leaves Red Hat, he will still hold it. And, everybody in the industry knows that Michael and I have been running OSI all this time. You got plenty of credit for doing that. But also,
Yeah.
I'm about 2 weeks away from leaving the company. Do they not tell you anything? And he had copied everybody that I ever worked for in his question. So I just replied to all of them. And the
That's funny.
next thing I know, he's taken me out to have lunch. He wants to talk about making me an SVP, to stay. Said, "That's what can we do to keep you here" thing. And
Yeah.
I was pretty sure, but I'd been there 6 years. I think that's the longest anybody should ever work anywhere, by the way. Um, and I knew it was time to go, so I told him no. And then, as I told you in our prelim, they slapped a non-compete on me, so I couldn't work on the thing I wanted to work on for Intel. I'm glad that those aren't legal anymore.
Yeah. One innovative thing about California. That
Yeah,
happens
well,
a
there's a
lot.
few.
Yeah.
There's a few good things. That if you work on a project, even if it's very close to the project you're being paid to work on, as long as you use your own material and your own time, that means your own computer, your own internet connection, your time off from work, all that, you can develop a competing product and bring it to market. This
Mm.
this this was tested in California by Mattel versus the Bratz dolls. Because that guy,
Huh.
he quit his Mattel job right before they launched the Brats, but he did all the work on it beforehand, using people he met while he worked at Mattel for things like who's going to model, who's going to mold the dolls, who's going to, all
Yeah.
that stuff, right? And of course, they wanted a piece of it because it was so successful. And he won in court. He had very good records that showed that he had not used their time, he had not used their resources, So that's precedent in California, and that's why we have the Pied Piper story, the Silicon Valley Pied Piper story. People that aren't in the industry that watch that thing, which of course is now old, but it's still true. That is not. I mean, it's funny, but it's actually a documentary. It's just people can't believe that that stuff really went on. I remember my husband and I would watch it, and they do something like the third guy that joins the team, whose name is Greg, because parents are drawn to the same names, and then 20 years later they enter the workforce, and there's way too many Matts or way too many Steves or whatever it's going to be, right? And so you come up with nicknames for them,
Yeah.
right? And I had literally just named somebody other Greg. And they did it in the show, and I said, I just did that. And my husband said, so did I.
That's funny.
Yeah. So if you're curious about the inner workings of the industry and how IP law affects startups, that's a really good thing to watch because it's all true.
Yeah. I don't know if you know Heather Meeker.
I do.
Yeah, she's one of our partners now for Intersect for open source licensing. She just let me know about that. That's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah.
Well, and it's education too on how to do open source effectively. Because at least one of the common things we're trying to address in Cardano is with Catalyst being a grant funding mechanism. Some people are open sourcing technology that doesn't need to be open source, or they're not getting the right license for it.
Right.
Now,
That's an
mind you,
age-old problem.
yeah, well, and we're steering away conversation from anything BSL, but if they should be at AGPL, they're going immediately Apache 2 because everyone's familiar with Apache 2, so it means they'll get the grant funding, but then the project doesn't really have a cascade after that to return back.
Yeah, well, so for those, this is inside baseball, but for those of you who don't know, the difference between the AGPL and all of their open source licenses is it tries to close the loophole, which I'm going to call the performance loophole, because all of these licenses were written back when distribution was a trigger, and distribution is one of the words in copyright law. Performance is not a word in copyright law, so there's no easy way to reference copyright law to fix this problem. Basically, the GPL and all other licenses, including all the Apache licenses, allow you to perform code over a browser. As long as you don't download that code onto your computer, as long as it's not sent to the user, that is a performance, not a distribution. And therefore, they that it doesn't trigger the requirement that you give back your secret sauce. Google's been living on this forever. They have a special version of Linux that they tuned for their search engine. They have the search algorithm. They definitely have trade secrets, and they open source all the time, but they're not worried about being forced to open source their trade secrets because all of their work is performative. They won't touch anything that's AGPL licensed. The AGPL says if you distribute or perform this code, you are required to show it and give back your changes. And so in a way, it's more in the spirit of free software. There were some compromises made in the history of free software to drive adoption. So, for instance, at one point, there was real concern among the government agencies in America because they are legally separate entities. The Army's different than the Navy's, different than the Marines, even though they all work through the Pentagon. And so they were afraid that that giving code developed for one branch of the service to another branch was going to trigger the distribution problem. And Richard Stallman went on record saying, no, that's not the intention of the GPL. From my perspective, it's all the same company. Now, that wasn't law, that was intent, but it could have been brought into court. There's and the LGPL is another example of that. People were not writing drivers for free software. because they were afraid they'd get too close to the distribution requirement. So the LGPL is like a limited use GPL that allows you to combine with GPL code, but gives you a get out of jail free card because it's a small, ubiquitous driver kind of thing. And then people started writing drivers that they could tweak to get to work on, say, Linux. IBM was very involved, and Intel as well, very involved in making sure that happened as often as possible. But in the early days, that was all kind of an open legal question, and it was solved with a compromise rather than, case law. So
Interesting. Did they change much with the GPL3, or is it still same?
yeah,
parameters?
GPL3 is its own weird beast. It's almost not the same license. The
Okay.
meetings to write the GPL3 were huge. I mean, imagine the big amphitheater at MIT full of licensing nerds. I went to all those meetings. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, I just play one on TV, but there were an awful lot of lawyers that were making their living on open source by then. Heather was in all those meetings. And there were backroom meetings as well. There were several levels of possible influence on the language of the project. And at the last minute, Sun was able to negotiate a pretty big change that makes GPL3 not that useful for most people. And then they proceeded to not use it.
Hmm.
I know. Simon has never explained to me what actually happened there, like what the intention was. I'm sure there's some dirty linen, but you probably won't get it out of him. So
As in nature with some of these things.
the main thing
Uh,
about the GPL is the inheritance thing, which says if you liked GPL1 and you licensed your project that way, you will be subject to every subsequent GPL that we write. So yeah.
Yeah, that's that kind of gets rid of the purpose of OS to begin with.
Well, so then
Uh,
a bunch of people opted out of the automatic inheritance of the next licenses, and that created a problem too. So
yeah. Well, and that's why people like the fork before there's a change in license, typically.
the
Uh,
GPL and all the work that Stallman and his colleagues did was groundbreaking, and we wouldn't have open source without them.
Yeah.
But it was there was a lot of
Politics surfing, good word to use again.
no, I was going to say there was some naivete about what would be persuasive. Now, not entirely naive. Do you know who Mitch Kapor is?
No, I do not.
Mitch owned a company called Lotus that put out a product called Lotus 123. He had Bob Frankston, and I'm going to forget the other guy's name. I'm so sorry. The two guys that wrote VisiCalc, and which was the first spreadsheet. And he hired them to make a spreadsheet for Lotus 123. And Microsoft stole a lot from them when they were writing Excel. Sorry. And there was a massive lawsuit so that Mitch could secure his rights because it was illegal what Microsoft did.
Yeah.
And they won. But every day that Mitch had to walk into court in Boston, at the time the Free Software Foundation was strongest in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they would be on the steps of the courthouse protesting because software should be free. And at some point, Mitch realized as he was walking into court that he agreed with them. And so after he won his lawsuit, he sold his company, moved to California, and started working on open source. So it was occasionally persuasive.
Yeah.
But not in the large. That if Tim O'Reilly hadn't sponsored the party where open source was coined and put all of his might behind making that a thing, we wouldn't be having this conversation today,
Well, because you're probably one of the key people who can answer this question pretty well. Given all your expertise from the beginning of open source, the founding of inner source, decentralization, Web3, AI, all these different techs coming together, there's different communities that tailor to each, and your strengths seem to be pulling from that, especially with coordinating. What would you say the term of community has evolved over that experience? or how would you define it?
Yeah, I think it's better understood now. If you want to look at an effective community management system, I think it pays to look at Drupal. You can argue that Drupal, either doesn't have the same momentum it did, or WordPress 1, or whatever you want to say about Drupal, but they had a community crisis. First of all, it was a lifestyle project. Almost everybody
Hmm.
that worked in it also lived it. They tended to be mom and pop shops. They tended to be working out of their homes, a lot of them. One of the partners would be good at design, and the other one would be good at and it maybe also talking to customers, and the other one would be good at the engineering, right? A lot of people got through decades with that expertise. But at some point there was a crisis because there was a member of that community that turned out to not be who they thought he was. And it really, really shook them. And watching how they pulled that all back together was fascinating to me. They clearly cared more about the community than they did at the end of the day about the project, although they thought the project would only do well if the community was cohesive. They spent a lot of time rebuilding trust and putting things in place that made people feel safe and not at risk for participating in that way. Because one of the reasons people work in corporations is it's safe. You can
Yeah.
hide, right? Um, so it takes some extra chutzpah to work in the clear. I used to say on stage all the time, we get paid about a third more. This used to be true. Open source developers were paid about a third more than regular developers. And I'd be like, do you know why that is? And, people would have ideas. I'd say, it's because we're willing to show our code, so it's got to be good. We're better coders,
Hmm.
right? And so you have to be willing to be seen. There are whole cultures where that's really difficult for people. Like open source happens now in Japan, but it's a little bit different than it is in the States, because you don't ever want to feel ashamed of what you've done.
Yeah.
And if you'll remember, open source used to be, or the free software used to be, kind of the Wild West. Flame wars were invented there, you know. So you couldn't really afford to be that way if you wanted to build a community in Japan. So anyway, I was serving on the Drupal board right at the time that this thing started happening, was towards the end of my time with Drupal, just because the first thing I do when I join a board is institute term limits. Nobody should be on a board more than 6 years in a row because you burn out. You can't help it.
Yeah.
And so, and then take a year off, see if you want to come back, like it's not the end of the world. Um, but it takes some finesse because you don't want all of your principal players taking their year off on the same year. You have to
Yeah.
stack that.
100%.
Anyway, so I was going off that board, but I was in a position to watch it pretty closely and see what all happened. And when I was setting up InterSource Commons, I wanted the same collegial spirit and niceness and basic trust of each other that they were striving for there in Drupal. And there's a bunch of stuff I did that I never did anywhere else. Um, but I saw that it was important to model the behavior I wanted to see. So every time somebody joined in the early days, I would welcome them every time. Every
Mm.
time somebody did something good, I would amplify that. I'd work really hard. Like if I got a speaking engagement, I'd bring somebody with me, like Addie, who'd never done that before. Just to keep trying to grow and get people to realize that there's no harm here, essentially. We had a few early harmers that were just jumping on the bandwagon, and we managed to collectively convince them that that wasn't a place they could do that. And to this day, InterSource Commons is really nice.
Mm.
It's really it's a sweet community. Not, I don't want to be saccharine about it, but nobody's got a knife out. In corporate America, I got stabbed a lot of times. I told you, somebody tried to fire me every month, sorry, every quarter that I was a son. Somebody was trying to fire me until the last 6 months when they all started wanting to take credit for the work I'd done. Right.
Yeah.
And this happens to women a lot, but it happens to people. I was feeling kind of butthurt about it for, a couple days. And then it dawned on me that I could declare victory and leave. So
Yeah.
I think it's important when you're thinking about getting into open source that you really evaluate. I was telling you about the class I taught before for change agents and risk assessment. What's your risk appetite like? How comfortable are you going to get enough sleep if you take this on?
Yeah,
Are you going to be up late at night going, "Oh fuck, I'm going to lose my job"? I'm sorry if I couldn't say that word.
you're
Um,
fine.
I got to a point where I cared more about the outcome than about my own path. And through probably dumb luck, I managed to um, get through it anyway, you
Hmm.
know. Um, there isn't, oh, and also things are generational. The hard-assed guys that started free software, by the time we got to open source, most people didn't want to work with them anymore. It's just too hard. We looked for a long time about why it was only 2% female, 2% female declared open source stuff, and yet there was a big chunk of us that were kind of at the top of the pyramid. So how did that happen, right?
Yeah,
Um, and some of it was women have better things to do than survive flame wars. They're
yeah,
not interested, right? Um, the so you know, try to make it be more fun to be in that community than it is at work. The first time Sam Ruby was at IBM for like 35 years or 40 years, something crazy like that.
hmm,
And he worked on Apache for a big chunk of that time. And I asked him early on, like, what would you do if IBM decided that you couldn't do open source anymore? And he said, I would leave. I would absolutely leave. I'd leave tomorrow. The most fun I have is at Apache. You want your job to feel that way.
yeah,
I was brought up to believe that if you aren't having fun at work, you're doing it wrong. And part of that fun is the collective gestalt of the people that are around you. That job I told you about between Apple and Sun when I was working for a small company, and I got a VP fired. That he was a bad VP. That team of 60 people was incredibly cohesive. We had all of our fun together. We threw parties all the time. And Apple, I had a budget to throw a beer bash every other Friday just so that the team would stay together and hang out and be friends. And um, there was a time when computing understood all of this. Some of it went away because of laws. You know, they decided in
yeah,
California that if you handed a beer to somebody and they went off and drunk drove into somebody, you were liable, right? So that changed the tenor of those parties a little bit. But also, most companies don't want to spend time on the human element. It's just a pain to them that people have to be involved.
yeah.
That's
Uh,
why ChatGPT looks so exciting, you know? Like, but at the end of
um,
the day, this is not an automatic thing. You know, people
yeah,
ask me sometimes what I think about generative AI. There's gonna be a boom in QA, is all I can say. Like, you know,
yeah,
that making stuff actually good enough for prime time is going to become is going to shift, but it's still required. Because if one company does it, and Apple always tries to, then everybody else has to try.
yeah. Well,
So
and for sure, it's going to be an interesting piece. Also, what AI is capable of is also the scary thing too. But like you're saying, QA is going to be the next hiring cohort. But apparently, AI can locate you by calculating the bouncing frequencies off of your Wi-Fi router,
yeah,
which I
so
did not know.
that was always possible. There's a famous guy in San Francisco who took a wrong turn on a snowy day. Um, God, it must be a decade ago now. He was a reviewer for one of the gadget magazines, so everybody knew who he was. And they got stuck, and they were stuck for days. And they
Oh,
were stuck for long enough that they ran out of food and they ran out of gasoline, and the snow wasn't melting yet. And he decided that he needed to go um, try to find people. And so he left his wife and two children, one of whom was still nursing, I think, in the car with the remaining gasoline. And he went out looking. And meanwhile, all of their friends in Silicon Valley are trying to figure out how to find them. And they finally start um, locating them from their sign ins to cell towers and the time signature. And
ah.
And so they hire private people to go find this family, and they found the wife and the kids in the car, and they found the husband frozen to death, maybe 100 yards from the car. He got lost when he went out. And I'm just saying that was a decade ago. That thing where you can triangulate has existed for a long time. It's just most people don't have access to the data. What was happening was somebody that worked for cell companies was illegally grabbing the signatures for good cause. I mean, the police could have subpoenaed them too.
Yeah. Well,
So,
and trusted the justice system if someone did that.
well, that's a different problem also.
Yeah, depending on how the laws and how morally inclined the judges.
I want to say that I'm pretty proud of the American judiciary. They're the last bastion now. They're holding their own, at least so
Yeah,
far. And it's got to be scary, you know.
for sure. Well, to help round off, I wanted one good question, and I think you've kind of hammered on the spirit of it altogether and all the interaction. What is the best advice you've ever received that you'd like to give back to others for them to hold on to?
Boy.
I think you've already given several gold nuggets so far.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is it's helpful if you're not maintaining dual identities. It's helpful if you can just be yourself, because then you can react in real time. The most of the people that I interacted with in the tech industry, if I was persuasive to them, it was because I could speak on my feet about the thing with some passion and some verifiable authenticity, right? It's important to stay authentic. There was an unfortunate trend around the 20th anniversary of open source where everybody wanted credit for having been there at the ground floor. The problem is that it was such a small floor that we all knew each other, and we also knew who wasn't there. And there were an awful lot of people that perjured themselves around what their early involvement was, which was unfortunate to see. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think aside from being authentic and clear, having I try to always design things that maybe touch 4 or 5 of the points that I'm trying to cover. So InterSource Commons did a bunch of things that I wanted to see happen at the same time, but I would have been happy if it only did 1 or 2 of those things. I just got lucky that the people that attached themselves to it early on were of equally generous spirit and continued, listened to me and tried to implement the whole vision. Because as I said before, I tried to not drive because I was getting an awful lot of flack from, like friendly fire from the open source community because I was somehow selling them out by teaching the secrets inside the companies. Because then why would they ever come in open source then? And I'm like, well, maybe they'd actually get it right. Think about how many
Yeah,
really disappointing open source announcements and subsequent attempts we've seen. This way, at least if they try it, they'll get it right. So
yeah. Well, and if you're building already your own inner source community, it gives you more of that advantageous thing to see the wider community that you could be interacting with. And that
yeah.
it,
And then
yeah,
it's a good thing to have an attitude of how hard can it be,
yeah,
right? Like brain surgery. How hard can it be? I mean, if the guy's gonna die anyway, I'd give it a go. Not to
Uh,
play not to play fast and loose. If there was somebody that was better qualified, I'd hand it to them in a minute. But be
yeah.
accurate about who
If you're
you
on the
are.
plane and somebody needs to,
Yeah,
so,
the big pen can be a tracheotomy tool, and we here.
well, we can end it with that great effect.
Now you know why people don't invite me over so much anymore.
Opportune brain.
No, I love
Uh,
this country. I love Ireland so much. I'm so happy to live here. I feel so privileged. And a lot of the reason that I live here is that career arc I had. It was the famous job working for Wikipedia. That's when Ireland offered me a place. So
Well, and Wikipedia, actually, I would say AI is nothing if Wikipedia wasn't around. So,
I
but
mean, that's been true for a long time. That incredible database that those people built, I think it's probably 500,000 people by now. It used to be 100,000 people at any given time were actively editing in all the different Wikipedias.
Well,
And, you know,
they are the certified source of everyone's high school essays and everything. We just found alternative links to put in the appendix, but Wikipedia is the only place everyone went to.
well, I mean, it's an
Yeah.
encyclopedia. It's not meant to be the article. It's meant to be a teaser and all the sources, so you then know where to research. That's what an encyclopedia is,
Yeah.
right?
I can't speak for the rest of my generation, but I definitely did enough to get by through high school until I got on the job. Yeah.
Well,
I
and
still,
that's the thing too. Fake it till you make it is also a thing.
yeah. Well,
So
and I'm trying to find ways to give back to them too, because I think they're an underappreciated asset, and it's like the wealth of human knowledge altogether.
yeah, well, that's their mission, and yeah, if you people I donate to all the time, Wikipedia, the EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation. If
Mhm.
you use the internet, I used to make people raise their hands if they had cable TV. With cable TV, this is not a thing anymore so much, but everybody raised their hands. And then I say, okay, keep your hands up if you give the same amount of money to the EFF that you give to your cable company. All the hands go down. Okay, here's why that's the wrong thing to do. You know?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the EFF is another one that I would always try to help.
Well, if everybody here, be sure to go support Wikimedia, go support the EFF and the InnerSource Commons. They will be in Berlin November 13th, so anyone at the Cardano Summit, if you're staying an extended stay, go visit them. I'll have the website link and everything in the bio.
Yeah, and
Um,
for other people that don't somehow make it to Berlin, they're also in New York and also in Yokohama the same day.
awesome. I'll put those clarifiers in the description. But thank you so much, Denise, for making time. I know I'm just a random ping. It's been several years, but thank you for coming and joining and helping elaborate the journey.
Yeah,
I'm
these
trying to
these days my best conversations are random pings. So
well, I'm trying to keep this an open podcast just to help everybody explore like the journey I went on. Yourself, Hart Montgomery, Dirk, and Jörg Link with Paterja are like the people I built my open source knowledge off of.
yep,
Because before that, I was just a gaming modder on Skyrim and learned through the creation engine open source ethos. That's its own
yeah,
subsect niche, but it's
right.
example of how a community can keep a game that's proprietary alive for 15 years past its duration.
Yeah, but
So
you got to have hobbies.
yeah, for sure. But thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate
sure
your time.
welcome. Thank you for calling, and thanks for all of you for listening.
Thank you.